I'm happy to be here with you all today. I'm Andrew Owens. I'm one of the elders here at Common Ground. I was here at the beginning of Common Ground 18 years ago. I've seen this community of believers experience the highs and lows, births and deaths and baptisms, departures from the body of believers. When I read Galatians, I certainly understand the notion of being part of a church and seeing that community experience different things. And as Matt kind of talked about last week, Paul certainly pulls no punches when addressing the believers in Galatia. This is what he says: I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. When I look back on our history as a church community, and I could imagine some similar words spoken about us, about me, over the course of the years, going back to 2003, and much like Paul, I would say that I had a moment of awakening, my own road to Damascus. But for me, I was in the driver's seat of my car, two friends in front and in back, engaged in this debate about faith and theology. And at that point in my life, I was lost and wandering, different from Paul, who was certainly militant in his belief that Christians needed to be purged from society in the first century. I would describe myself as a boat at sea without an oar. That's where I was. Paul was in this place where he was going after the church, he was going after Christians, and I was this boat at sea without any sort of oar, without any sort of direction, without any sort of ability to kind of steer myself and where I needed to go. My faith as a believer had been cracked and broken over the years, being exposed to the hypocrisies of the church and the failure to see the church make much tangible difference in the circles in which I found myself. But as my friends spoke and discussed issues of repentance, forgiveness, and rebirth, I had this moment of clarity. So there they are, they are right there in the seats next to me, one in the front, one in the back, and they're talking about these things and they, hitting on all these different topics. And I had this moment of clarity, this moment where I kind of feel like for me, just like what is described with Paul in Acts, the scales kind of fell away from my eyes and I could understand. You see, up to that point, my concept of faith was a scorecard of my progress towards attainment of some status, of some sort of perfect Christian. Truth be told, I was never an outwardly troublemaking or trouble-seeking person, but my friends joked about me in high school and college that they couldn't imagine me sinning. Like when they just tried to describe me, they would say things like, Drew, I can't even imagine you sinning. And in my weakness, I kind of felt like this sense of pride, not in that I had really achieved anything. Certainly not that their perceptions of me were at all consistent or accurate with who I really was, but the pride came from this part of me that felt like I had done enough to fool enough people into believing me to be this model of Christian perfection outwardly. So all these people kind of felt like, hey, here's Drew and he's got it figured out. But certainly on the inside, that was far from accurate. And while inwardly I was fearful and anxious and insecure and lonely and probably a lot of other adjectives, quite honestly, searching for some sort of anchor in which to moor myself, I would go through days and weeks of destructive self-talk when I contemplated my failures and I would come before God, sort of trembling in fear that I would be struck down on the spot like Ananias and Sapphira. I held it in my heart that God was probably quite merciful to a great many people, but in my mind, he was the angry God, and I was that sinner that Jonathan Edwards wrote about in 17th century Massachusetts. At that time of my life, I really held two jobs. I held the one that provided me with an income and health insurance and everything else, and then my second job was acting like a full-time Christian. That was really my second job. It was in this label of Christian that I found a sense of belonging, friends, and it kept me from kind of disappearing into this mass of humanity. And I could not lose that title and the status that the title provided to me. And then on my own road to Damascus, which was really the highway to a friend's wedding, it struck me. God did not really require anything in perfecting my faith in order to receive his grace. I understood that really for the first time. And from that point on, I began to fully comprehend, after 12 years of trying to be a Christian, that the receipt of God's grace was a gift, and I could do nothing to earn anything I received from God. And recognizing and accepting that fact, that I was incapable of saving myself or earning God's favor. It was what would lead to the change in my heart and my character that I had been so desperate for all those years. I love this verse in Galatians chapter 1. For I did not receive it, the gospel, from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And this is Paul talking. He's writing the Galatians this verse. For I did not receive it, the gospel, from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. I think why this speaks so much to me, and why I love it so much, is that I feel similar to this in what transpired that night that I was on the road to North Carolina. Much like Paul, I had come to understand so much about the gospel over the years. I had so much head knowledge. He became familiar with the gospel and his own head knowledge, mostly to track down and imprison Christians, imprison them, know thy enemies kind of a thing. I came to know it so well so that I could camouflage myself in Christianity in order to find a home in this world. So we both had so much head knowledge, but both of us in our own unique experiences kind of felt like the revelation of Jesus Christ that I received was not taught to me, but it was really something that we both experienced directly from God. Both Paul and I factually knew that what the theory of Jesus was all about, but neither he nor I really understood up until a certain point in our lives what the implications of the gospel truly meant. The power of the gospel to hold and transform lives, to transform the world. But as Paul has his encounter with Jesus on the road, he is filled with this passion to spread the word of Jesus with the same intensity and fervor in which he formerly persecuted the church. I had these similar experiences myself. You can see in Galatians 1:24 what this meant for those early Christians. Their arch nemesis had encountered Jesus and been transformed. This Christian hunter, Paul, was now on a mission to share how Jesus was real and could bring life to that which was dead. It was a cause to celebrate how powerful the grace of Jesus could be. Chapter 2 in Galatians begins with Paul's description of his revelation, a revelation that is certainly applicable to today. For those of you who grew up in the church, you know that where Paul lived in the time in which he lived, there were the Jews and there were the Gentiles, Jews being the descendants of Abraham and Gentiles being everybody else. And for Paul, as a Jewish man, he grew up in this social understanding that who he was, how he saw himself, how he saw others, and how he saw the world was through the lens of there are the Jews, us, and how he's and then there's everybody else. And this mindset of Jews and non-Jews made the time in which Paul lived particularly difficult for Jews. They were not in power. It was the non-Jews, the Romans, who held all the power, made all the decisions, decided who could get what, who could go where. Everything was decided by these non-Jews. And these Romans appointed Jewish men to rule who were unsuitable to people and in the minds of people like who Paul used to be. These men that were appointed were not close followers of the commandments of God. They were not followers closely of the laws of Judaism. And many of the Jews at that time, they kind of perceived that there were all these external threats to their identity from all around, from the Gentiles, from these non-believing Jews in power. And then there was this new group that started to emerge in Paul's time that was a threat to the identity of of the Jews, and were these heretics that were calling themselves Christians. And for those of you that were unfamiliar with the peculiarities of like the Jew and Gentile issue from the New Testament, I would just challenge you to think of any story from your life or any story from history in which there was a group who believed that they held truth, that their way of life was superior, that outsiders were unclean and unwelcome. We could call them the in-group if you want. And then there was the out-group. The in-group, they had the way to truth, the self-appointed superiority, and the desire to be part to be a part and to be uninfluenced by all the others. And then there was this out group for those with different views, different ways of life, different politics. Think about all those examples and the reactions of the in-group when the outsiders come into power. And I don't think we have to think too hard about such examples, because we literally live in a city with battlefields all around us to remind us of a time when the in-group lost power and standing. We are literally, our homes sit on the fields where these encounters happen. We live in a place where one way of life dominated and then it was replaced by another. So we could think about it as, as these in-groups losing their power and what that means for them and what happens after that. So here we have Paul. He was the arch defender of this in-group of the Jews, before. He's coming, but now he's coming to Jerusalem. He's had his encounter with Jesus. He's coming to Jerusalem to meet with the leaders of this new group that he belongs to now, this group of Christians. And make no mistake, he's not going to Jerusalem to meet with esteemed leaders of the in-group, right? I mean, he's going to meet with Peter. He's going to meet with James. He's going to meet with John. He's going to meet these people as part of an out-group, the group that he formerly persecuted, an out-group that his old tribe despised. His old tribe of Pharisaic Jewish individuals, they viewed these Christians and their leaders, Peter, James, and John, as out-group members, even though all of these leaders, Peter, James, John, all these leaders, they came from Jewish families themselves. They still considered themselves to be Jews, but they had deviated from the ways of the in-group. And when they did that, they became part of this out-group. And when you or I deviate from the ways of the in-group, we become outsiders as well. That's just the way life works. And Peter, John, and James were definitively outsiders. All of these things being considered, Paul does something pretty amazing. Paul comes to them and he says that he must preach the gospel to another outgroup, not the Jewish believing Christians that are in Jerusalem. He comes to them and he says, I'm feeling this call to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, the most outest of out groups, right? I mean, these are Romans, these are Greeks, these are Syrians, these are Persians. Paul and Peter had already lost so much in the eyes of their Jewish family members and their community, their neighbors, the people they used to work with. They had already lost so much standing. They had been put aside. They had been cast out away from this community. And in some ways, they still had a couple of things going for them, though. I mean, they still considered themselves to be Jewish. They still considered themselves to be, part of this community. But now Paul is looking to increase his connection with the Gentiles. He feels that it is now the time, and God has put it in front of him, that he and Barnabas and some of the people that were along with them, they needed to go and they needed to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And in the minds of many Jewish people, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had already, Paul and Peter and James and John, they had already betrayed so much of what it meant to be a Jewish person in that time. And now you have this Jewish man who was then saying, not only do I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the only way to salvation, but now I'm going to take that message and I'm going to bring it out to the Gentiles. There's so much here, my friends. I mean, we could probably spend a good 8 weeks just talking about all the things that are part of these verses, from Galatians 1:18 to Galatians 2 verses 10. There are these false believers that are mentioned in verse 4. There are the verses 9 and 10, which cannot be read outside of the context that we will probably be discussing next week and the upcoming weeks. But let's just dwell on this radical notion that God brings through Paul. Not only has the gospel presented this radical notion to the in-group, that grace in a place with God cannot be earned or achieved through anything other than through Christ. Think about all the customs and practices that Jews up until the time of Jesus went through and held so dear to keep their place with God. Counterfactual to the laws and the restrictions of the in-group had lived and abided by their whole life. This grace was now being extended outside of the in-group. So up until that point, largely Peter and James and John, they had been preaching and they had been teaching to the Jews that lived in and around Jerusalem and been bringing these people to the gospel of Christ. But now Paul is saying, I'm going to take this gospel and I'm going to take it out. We have spoken so long and taught so long to the Jewish believers and trying to bring people that were part of the tribe of Judaism into this growing group of Christians. But now we need to extend it out. We need Romans and Greeks and Syrians. We need them to hear the gospel as well. God is calling for these people to also be included in the good news of Christ. So their way of their way of life, their view of the world, their place in the world, their identity as a people was being challenged by this gospel. The Jewish people, their identity as people were being challenged by this gospel. Now even more so that Paul is saying, I want to take the gospel and present it to the out group. For centuries, there was this in-group and there's out-group dynamic. The Bible tells us of Jericho and Moses and Egypt, of David and the Philistines, of the Babylonians and their raid of Israel. All of these examples of people and of God's people and some other people. And now Paul is coming to his religious and ethnic brethren, and he's telling them, it is time for the message of Christ to be brought to the descendants of those people. So the ancient ancestors of Palestine, the Egyptians of Moses' day, the ancient Philistines, all of these people's great descendants who are living among Paul and Peter now, Paul is saying that the gospel should be heard by some of these people, but these people whose very descendants were the arch enemies of Israel. This is what he's saying. One of my all-time favorite movies is about the events in the aftermath of the 1972 Olympics in Munich. And one of the scenes, the head of this small band of like Israeli agents, it's all about sort of the Israeli government's response to Israeli athletes being killed in the Munich Olympics. And this leader of the small band of Israeli agents is speaking with an older man who lived through World War II in France. And the older man played the part of like the sage kind of character, a modern like Socrates kind of thing, who had known life and death and all manner of events in between. And his line to this Israeli leader was, "The world has been rough with your tribe." And he's talking about the Jews. And I think about this line, and as I read this account in Galatians, and I think about the transformation of Paul from this arch Pharisee to Christian to preacher of the gospel to the Gentiles, I think to myself, the bold faith and the unwavering belief in the message of Jesus that Paul held, to have been transformed so completely and so thoroughly to now be radicalizing the very system of belief that led him to arrest and murder of others just years before is really remarkable. And it makes me take a deep breath and ask myself, to what depth have I been willing to allow the Spirit of God to take me into the lake of faith in Christ? You know, Paul, he was living this life, very successful, has this experience with Jesus, and then just completely 180s and goes the other direction and says, there is nothing that I count as gain other than Christ. And then I asked myself that question. I would ask you to ponder the same question. To what depth have you been willing to allow the Spirit of God to take you in the lake of faith in Christ? Put a pin in that and hold that for a little bit as we keep going. If we take a look at chapter 2, verse 3, Paul is kind of describing this group that he is bringing up to speak with Peter and James and John. He talks about Titus, a Gentile who was not compelled to be circumcised, and says, this matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment. So what is really going on here? Paul is coming to the apostles in Jerusalem. You know, all of the famous characters that you and I know, James and John and Peter. He's coming to them to speak with them about his revelation to go and preach to the Gentiles. And for Paul, this was not a mission to add Jewish law to those who were not under Jewish law. He was not going and telling the Romans or the Greeks or the Syrians that they needed to be circumcised and they needed to do this and other things in order to receive the grace of Christ. His mission was to preach the gospel of Christ, the freedom to be made reconciled with God regardless of a person's heritage. And Paul, in writing the Galatians, he talks about that there are these false believers, and who knows how many there are. Paul says that there are these false believers that were insisting that if anyone came to Christ, they needed to be circumcised and begin keeping the laws of Israel like the Jewish Christians. And for this group, any acceptance of Christ and becoming a child of God required a new believer to fall under the same system of practices that Jewish people had held for centuries. And Paul resoundingly says no. And Paul's message is clear and simple. There is nothing that needs to be added to the gospel of Christ to bring somebody the freedom in Jesus. There's nothing that could be added to the gospel that can bring any more freedom than what Christ has already brought through his death and resurrection. Let me see if I can make this very, very clear to our minds with the most possible clarity that I can. There were Christians who were telling people new to the faith of Jesus that they needed to behave and follow additional rules in order to be a true believer. And my friends, I don't know where that hits you this morning. I don't know if that kind of breezes past you like a gentle breeze, or if that hits you like a wave at the beach. I can recall some of my lowest moments over the course of my 37 years on this planet have been those where I put up hurdles between people and the gospel. Times when I moved the fence in order for me to continue on in the exclusivity of this club that I wanted all to me, my friends, and those who looked at the world and who shared the same politics as me. Some of my lowest moments have been those where, looking back, I say to myself, I was doing exactly what these people that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 2. These false believers who said you needed to do X, Y, and Z in addition to believing that Christ died for you and was resurrected and has given you new life in him. And when contemplating the ways in which a person, ways in which this has been done in America, several come to mind, quite honestly. And these are just some. You probably could think of others as well. If you vote for that particular party or president, how can you call yourself a Christian? Christians cannot be socialists. Christians cannot be capitalists and be in line with Jesus. How can you support Black Lives Matter and consider yourself right with Jesus? How can you think abortion is legal and say that you believe in God? What's your stance on climate change? What's your stance on the unrest in whatever country is out there? What is your stance on what's happening at the border? All of these things have been said, and I have said some of them myself over the years. I have heard some of these things said to me. In all of these things, though, what's clear is this. There are people who love God, call themselves Christians, believe that they are in the right, but are making it more difficult for others to find God through the gospel of Christ. And I think right now, where we are seeing an enormous shift happening within the church that kind of defines itself as evangelical. The same shift that occurred within mainline churches throughout the 20th century, I think we're seeing that now as well. And I believe it's for the same reasons that Paul kind of discusses in Galatians, quite honestly. It's like you cannot shift the goalposts on the gospel of Christ. The gospel makes it clear what is the path to Jesus and how we find redemption with God through Christ. Now, I in no way want to make light of any of those things that I just mentioned. I think they're all very important. I think that they are things that need to be considered with great prayer and great compassion towards people. They are an important part of our communities, an important part of our country, the world that we live in, and they play a part in the future of generations. I see kids kind of walking on different cameras. I have 2 young children myself. I know that each of those things is going to be a part in the lives of my children and my grandchildren and their children and their grandchildren into the future. But my friends, let's be certain about the direction we should be moving in as a community. James, Peter, and John, upon hearing Paul's vision for the work that he and Barnabas want to do, that they want to take the gospel and they want to go out to the Gentiles and they want to make it available to the people that look differently and speak differently and have different politics and have different practices. What do Peter, James, and John do upon hearing this? Let's look at verse 9. Paul saying, they, Peter, James, John, the leaders, the apostles in Jerusalem, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me, they agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. And then in verse 10, all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. And when I hear that, I think, where would we be as a community, a city, a country, if the church, if our concern was on bringing the freedom of the gospel to people while remembering the poor? I don't have an answer to that. It's certainly a question that I would encourage you to ponder. Another question to ponder: what is God wanting you to know about grace this week? And then still another question to ponder might be: in what ways are you adding barriers to the gospel for others in your life? I pray that you ponder these questions as we continue to hear what Paul is wanting to communicate to his Galatian brothers and sisters in the weeks to come. I certainly think that when I read this section in Galatians, I think what comes to mind is Paul has this enormous passion to ensure that the gospel of grace that comes through Jesus is being preached without any sort of additions to it. He wants to make sure that people are able to hear that Jesus came, he taught, he lived, he died, and was resurrected in order to bring grace to everyone who believed in that and believed in him. And Paul is trying desperately, when the whole book of Galatians is about this church who was struggling to stay true to the gospel that they received when they first came into existence as a church community. He's trying so hard to help them to see the ways that they have added on to that gospel. And as we continue to move in through Galatians, and we recognize that it's something for us to consider, that the things that Paul is writing to the Galatians might be just as true for us today, and are certainly true of many different churches and many different communities of believers around the country and around the world. That adding to the gospel in order to ensure that people's politics or their view of life or whatever other sort of external quality you or I want to think about is added and is a qualifier in order to be a part of the community. And Paul is trying to help the Galatians, and I think God is trying to teach us that those things are irrelevant when it comes to what is being offered to us by Jesus on the cross and in his resurrection. We're going to move into a time of communion. Certainly for us, this is a consideration of grace. It is because of grace that we can all come to the table together and remember the sacrifice of Christ. So wherever you are, find your bread and find your wine and join us in communion. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he raised up the bread and he broke it, saying, "This is my body broken for you." He raised the cup and he drank from it, saying, "And this is my blood poured out for you. Let us eat and drink together as we remember the grace offered to us," and then we'll continue in worship.